All right, everyone, here we go with the notes for Chapter 13, talking about effects in media, both as a result of media on culture and culture's effects on to media. Now, before we get started, what I want to say is that the lecture notes are basically going to be an overview of some of the concepts that are talked about in this chapter. If you want to take a deep dive into some of the details of the concepts and some of the case studies, I highly recommend that you take the opportunity to read through the material. But the notes here are basically just going to be an overview of some of the ideas. So with that said, here we go. In electronic media research, several techniques are used to gather data about audience effects. It's possible to say that there are 4 main social scientific methods, at least as we talk about them in the scope of broadcasting. First off, experimental methods, which can take place either in controlled laboratory conditions or they can happen in more natural field conditions. We'll talk a little bit about the distinctions there. One thing they have in common is that usually at least 2 groups are involved. One group gets treated one way, while the other group gets treated differently. So there's kind of a measure between what happens when an effect is placed onto one particular group, but that same effect is not impacted on the other group. So, as far as lab experiments goes, the big advantage here is that they allow researchers to make statements about cause and effect. When an action or a circumstance is placed on a group or an individual, they can monitor what the reaction is, what the effect is of that action. And it's a controlled environment, so they can make an apples-to-apples comparison between different peoples and different groups. The big disadvantage is that they are done under artificial conditions. So behavior that occurs in the lab might not occur in real life. There's certain temperaments and attitudes that we have when we go into a lab experiment like this, whether you are the one conducting the experiment or you are one of the subjects that the experiment is based on. There may be certain premonitions or thoughts of what certain outcomes should be, and those things can skew what the actual results of the experiment should really be. As far as field experiments, the big advantage here is that they are more natural. In other words, people are studied in their typical environment. So you're living life as normal, and you are being watched and observed as to how you react to things that happen in normal everyday life. However, the big disadvantage here is the lack of control. You can't keep outside forces from coming in and possibly tainting the results that happen. So you may not necessarily have the same sort of apples to apples sort of comparison that you would have in a lab-based experiment. Survey methods, second scientific method that we'll talk about. This can happen with either samples of subjects over just one particular instance, or they can happen continually over time. The big advantage here of survey research is its realistic approach. People in natural settings are asked questions about their typical behaviors. So it's that idea of someone approaching and saying, what do you think? What is your reaction to this? What do you know about this? And it's kind of, living in that moment. Big disadvantage with surveys is the fact that they can't establish cause and effect. It's just responding to questions. So you can't actually see the natural order of what would happen if X situation was placed onto Y subject to get Z result. You're basing it totally on the word of the person that you're asking the questions to. So what different types of surveys can be done? Well, there's the one-time surveys, kind of like that person on the street sort of thing, where you picture somebody with a clipboard on the corner downtown or in the mall, basically asking questions of people. That's kind of just a one-shot instant sort of thing. There's also longitudinal studies. These are studies that are repeated over time, where you have several instances of someone asking groups of people's questions, generally different people, over different points in time, maybe different places as well. Trend studies are those in which the same question is asked of different people at different times. So that's something where you may see this happening over an extended period and trying to get the idea of perhaps if changes of thought happen as different circumstances happen within the culture. And panel studies, they're a special type of longitudinal study in which the same people are studied at different points in time. So it's revisiting the same subjects and asking them the same questions, but studying how those particular people change over a certain period. Third type of scientific method is content analysis. This is a systematic method for analyzing and classifying communication content. This is useful in describing messages presented by the media. So it's the idea of taking a look at what is being done in the broadcast world. What's the content in radio, in television? What are the messages embedded in that content? And taking a look at what's really happening with said content. Finally, you have meta-analysis, which is a method that looks at a number of existing studies about a similar topic and then summarizes the main findings. It does so by using statistical procedures that highlight which results are going to be consistently found. So it's, in a way, very much taking a lot of different research, poring over that research, and making an analysis of things by looking at everything and coming up with certain generalizations. It's very much a what they call a macro view, which is a term basically saying taking a look at the big picture and coming up with a good synopsis of those major findings. So meta-analysis is very much trying to summarize and pull out the main points of what is going on. So now let's turn our attention to various theories of media effects. And there's three main ones that we're going to take a look at here in our discussion. First off is the hypodermic needle therapy. This idea holds that mass communicated messages would have strong and more or less universal effects on the audience that they've reached. So basically, it's the idea that when media puts out a particular message, that it's something that kind of gives a shot in the arm to the public and has a certain amount of influence on the public. Certain examples would be the various ways that propaganda have been used in various parts of the world. Also, entertainment has had an effect in this sort of way. The radio drama War of the Worlds, the infamous one where people thought that there was an alien invasion happening in the United States that caused quite a panic in the hearts of many people that had tuned into that broadcast rather late and were not able to understand that it was a drama and was not a real news event. It caused a lot of panic in many Americans and really had that sort of way of influencing people based on what they had heard. Secondly, the limited effects theory. Media influence would first pass through a group of people known as opinion leaders and then on to the rest of the audience. So that media itself was not being an influencer, but it was being a conduit for those that were influencing, just providing the means for people to be able to share their message with the mass audience. And thirdly, the specific effects theory. Researchers realize that media are not all-powerful. They compete with or at times complement other sources of influence such as friends, family, and teachers. However, there are circumstances under which specific types of media content might have a significant effect on certain members of the audience. Basically, what it's saying here is that media can at times come in agreement with or sometimes challenge some of the different influences that a person has outside of the realm of broadcasting. Now, several research studies have identified an agenda-setting effect. Basically, the idea here that the mass media choose to emphasize certain topics, thereby causing the public to perceive these issues as important. And we've seen that happen a lot, not just with news cycles, but with various types of programming that comes out over certain periods of time, and the messages that they portray. And it's that idea that it can seem like those that have a certain amount of influence in the broadcast industry might be able to tailor content in such a way that they are trying to affect change in one way or another, but it could also be that the media are trying to reflect changes that are in the culture and provide the content that they perceive listeners and viewers want. It continues to be an ongoing topic, and deciding which one happens more often and which one is stronger than the other. Okay, let's take a look at a rather ongoing sort of issue that's been commonplace in discussions about media, and that is violence in video. First off, a little bit of history. Since the 1930s, groups have raised concerns and done studies as to whether violence in media was an important factor in shaping the attitudes and characters of its audience. One of the ideas here is that of effect size. This approach gets away from the simple question of whether TV violence has an effect on the audience and considers instead the more complicated question of how big of an effect it has. So it's basically the idea of looking at whatever violence is available in the entertainment world and asking, number one, how much of it is there? Number two, how much it has an effect on the audience? Number three, how much of an effect in what sort of material, evidential sort of way? Is it a huge effect? Is it a small effect? What exactly are we looking at here, and how concerned should we be about it? The Telecommunications Act of 1996 was one of the main pieces of legislation in which the government stepped in, and they mandated that new television sets be equipped with a V-chip that would allow parents to block out violent content and other forms of objectionable behavior from their television sets. Up to this point, most studies had shown that there was some effect of violence in terms of how it impacted viewers of that violence. And they've done it for all ages. They especially concentrated on children and the way that involves. So most of the research would show that it does have a certain amount of effect. There's discrepancy in those research results that show to what extent. Some kind of blow an alarm of sorts, while others say that the effect would be rather minimal, if there's any at all. The sale of violent video games to minors was a kind of a subset of this issue as we went further and further along. There was at one point several states that had made it illegal to sell those kinds of games to minors, but then a federal judge ruled such laws to be against the First Amendment. So at this point, there's not really a legal restriction that can be enforced that keeps children from being able to buy violent video games. Research evidence. In the 1960s, there were two competing theories. The first one being the catharsis theory. This gave the position that watching scenes of media violence would actually reduce the aggressiveness of viewers because their hostile feelings would be purged while watching the media portrayals. So this is the idea that by watching violence being played out that perhaps those that were watching it would no longer feel the need to conduct aggressive behavior. The contrary view is that of the stimulation theory. It predicted that watching scenes of violence actually promoted audience members to behave more aggressively after the viewing of such content. Experiments showed the stimulation theory to be more prominent, but the experiments were criticized for artificiality. In other words, many of the problems with the experiments in the eyes of those that showed criticism were that the experiments focused on showing subjects certain types of violence that, at least at the time, would not normally had been experienced by those viewing violent content. It was much more extreme than what people would have been accustomed to. So with those particular theories at that time, there's still a lot of question as to the validity of those various studies. More recent experiments have accepted the fact that exposure to violence facilitates subsequent aggression and have concentrated instead on factors that might increase or decrease the amount of aggression performed in response to media portrayals. So it's become pretty much acceptable that violence on television can have a certain effect and cause people to perhaps be a little more aggressive. But how much so? To what degree? That is what's still in question. There is modest but consistent association between viewing violent television programs and aggressive tendencies. The majority of the studies seem to suggest that the sequence of causation is that viewers that watch TV violence causes viewers to become more aggressive. In addition, the process seems to be reciprocal. Watching TV violence encourages aggression, which in turn encourages the watching of more violent TV and going back and forth and back and forth. It becomes very much this kind of cycle. Those that watch violence may find themselves committing acts of violence, and that feeds into wanting to watch more violence, and on and on and on as the circle keeps rolling. Today's consensus among social scientists: first off, television violence is a cause of subsequent aggression tendencies, but it is not the cause, since many factors besides television determine whether people behave aggressively. This is because it's pretty much accepted that while watching violence can cause aggressive behavior, that the amount that it does so is not usually going to be that great, and it's not going to be the sole factor of that built-up aggression. The precise impact of TV violence will be affected by many other factors, including age, sex, family interaction, the way violence is presented on the screen. There's a whole lot more that's going on. So in relative terms, the effect of TV violence on aggression tends to be small. It may be one contributing factor, but by and large, it's not going to be the primary or the only contributing factor. As far as video game violence goes, in the 1990s, a new type of video game appeared, the first-person shooter. These games put the player behind the sights of various weapons, and the main object was the killing or wounding of opponents. And there was concern about this as well. Basically, what has happened here with the lab experiments that were conducted in this area, they found that by and large, playing violent video games resulted in at least a short-term increase in aggressive actions and aggressive thoughts, kind of the same as what we deal with watching violence on TV. It may create aggressive tendencies, but it's not going to be the only factor, and it's also most likely not going to be the primary factor. So at this point, this is a good spot for us to take a break. We will finish up the chapter with part B of this video. I'll see you over there.